Welcome to She Persisted. I'm your host, Sadie Sutton, a 19-year-old from the Bay Area studying psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. She Persisted is the teen mental health podcast made for teenagers by a teen. In each episode, I'll bring you authentic, accessible, and relatable conversations about every aspect of mental wellness. You can expect evidence-based teen-approved resources, coping skills, including lots of DBT, insights, and education in each piece of content you consume. She Persisted offers you a safe space to feel validated and understood in your struggle, while encouraging you to take ownership of your journey and build your life worth living. So let's dive in. This week on She Persisted.
We know that connecting with people when we're depressed, that's really helpful. And yet the nature of those mental health struggles is that you want to avoid those things. They seem like they're too much to even take on. And so I think about that a lot with suicidal thoughts, that hopelessness feels like there isn't any point in doing anything. And when someone says to someone who's hopeless, well, why don't you just do these things and you'll feel better? Unfortunately, that can make things worse because the person can feel ashamed for not being able to do those things that might help them.
Hello, and welcome to She Persisted. We're starting off with a little trigger warning. We are talking about suicidal thoughts and behaviors today, which can be a heavier topic. We came at this from a really intentional and evidence-based approach. We have a clinical psychologist on the podcast today who's been involved in a lot of research on suicidal thoughts and behavior. So we definitely come at this from a lens that is clinically supported and not intentionally triggering or graphic or anything like that. But this is a heavier topic. And I know personally in my journey, there was a long time where anything that related to suicidal ideations or behaviors I steered clear from intentionally because it was a trigger that brought up those thoughts, and engaging in those in any capacity wasn't effective and was in some cases maladaptive. So be mindful, decide if this is for you, if it's not for you. If you're someone who's listening to this episode to support someone else, definitely recommend. We talk a lot about how you can actually support someone, what they're going through, why they're having these thoughts and feelings. And I think from that perspective, this episode is incredible. So if you're also listening and you're like, this isn't something I've struggled with, but like I have a friend or a family member, you're going to love this. But wanted to give that initial warning before we get into the episode because it is a heavier topic, and set your own boundaries. But with that, we have Kathryn Gordon on the podcast today. She's a licensed psychologist, speaker, and author. She specializes in cognitive behavioral therapy, also known as CBT, and she's written several books on using CBT skills to prevent suicide. So we talk about a lot of different things in this episode. We talk about why people have suicidal thoughts, which is something which is really misunderstood and not widely known. We talk about how suicidal ideations and thoughts progresses to behaviors. We talk about healthy conversations about suicide and what you can do to promote those healthy convos. We talk about co-ruminating and setting boundaries, what to expect when you are in therapy for suicidal thoughts or behaviors, which is another huge point of anxiety for a lot of people. So I hope that's helpful to kind of shed some light on. We touch on CBT skills that are most effective for suicidal thoughts, which I was really excited to touch on because that's not something that's widely known or accessible or available in the mental health space. You kind of have to dig for it. So I'm really excited for you guys to hear that perspective. And then lastly, resources for someone when they are in a crisis or navigating really intense suicidal ideation or behaviors. So I hope you guys find value from this episode. It's information that I wish I would have had access to earlier on in my journey and provides so much insight and perspective if you know someone in your life who's struggling with these thoughts and behaviors. And again, listen at your own risk. We, again, tried to be really, really intentional and come at this from an evidence-based perspective where we're not doing anything that's known to trigger these thoughts and behaviors, but be mindful and you know yourself best. And if you guys do find this episode, make sure to share with a friend or family member, post about it on social media. This is information that can really help and save lives. And so if you find it valuable, if you find it relevant to your journey or others, make sure to share and leave a review. So with that, let's dive into the episode. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Kathryn. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. This is an episode and conversation that I don't think is had on a lot of podcasts, even in the mental health niche, but I think it's something that's really important for people to be aware of, especially from an evidence-based perspective and getting that expert opinion. So I'm really excited to have you on today and talk about your work and your workbook and all things suicidal thoughts, ways to cope with that, different interventions, how to prevent suicide. But to get started, can you tell me a little bit about your background and and why you decided to go into psychology and then specialize in this specific area.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on. I
Of
just think it's
course.
wonderful to create more space for these types of conversations. We know that they're really important and that also there is a lot of fear and shame around suicidal thoughts. So making it accessible like this is really important. So thank you for inviting me on. To focus on the background of how I got into it. Basically, my father is a therapist, and so I had kind of just grew up with some awareness of mental health issues and also just over time, maybe especially as a teenager, knew a lot of people who were struggling with different mental health problems. And I was always really interested in psychology. And so when I was an undergraduate student, I was able to work with Dr. Thomas Joyner and learn about eating disorders and suicide prevention. And what I learned is that those two areas were really understudied at the time, that there was such a need for more research about what causes suicidal thoughts and behaviors and how to help people with suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So, really, that inspired and sparked passion to continue pursuing that area. And in addition to all of us know people in our lives or we ourselves have struggled with different things. And so those pieces pulling together are what really led me down the path of focusing on suicide prevention and eating disorders.
Yeah. I really like that framework you presented of like why people feel suicidal and then what we can do to support and help. And I definitely want to touch on the piece of shame and kind of different responses when you go to someone and express that you're feeling suicidal. I was at ABCT this weekend and we were talking about digital resources and ethical concerns, and that's obviously like a big layer there, especially when you're not interfacing with a therapist. And so excited to get all your thoughts. But to back things up a bit, I think a lot of people either have never experienced suicidal thoughts or they have experienced them, but they don't understand why. Like, even though this is their own lived experience and the emotions are coming up for them, there's kind of that disconnect of like, why am I responding to situations with these thoughts? Or why is this the way that I'm coping with this? So to kind of give some increased understanding for both perspectives, why do people have suicidal thoughts or suicidal ideation? And then I'm sure we'll also get into behaviors as well.
It's a great question. I was at ABCT as well, so I wish I
Oh
would have known
my God.
we could have
We
met up
should
in
have
person.
connected.
Well,
Yes. Oh
maybe
my
next
gosh.
year.
Yes.
It's a really, really important question. And in terms of what causes suicidal thoughts, there are two scientific theories in particular that have helped me to understand what prompts suicidal thoughts. And I found that one, it's important that they've been scientifically tested and have some empirical support for them, but also two, in my work as a therapist, that they tend to resonate with people who struggle with suicidal thoughts. The first is the interpersonal theory of suicide by Thomas Joyner and colleagues, and it really focuses on the idea that suicidal thoughts tend to arise when someone is feeling isolated and alone, like they don't belong. Simultaneously, they're feeling like they're a burden on others. And importantly, it's the perception that they're a burden, that the people in their lives are negatively impacted by them continuing living. And so the idea is if you feel alone and like your existence is a burden on others and you're hopeless about those being able to change, that the idea of escaping that pain and finding a way out makes sense. It's really hard to think about, but it also makes sense when someone is in that much pain that suicide would come up as a way to think about escaping that pain. So that's one framework. The other framework, the three-step theory by David Klonsky and colleagues, the three-step theory of suicide talks about that suicidal thoughts arise when someone is in pain and they're hopeless about it. And the pain can be emotional pain, physical pain, different types of pain. But the idea is that the pain is so strong. And again, that belief that it's never going to change. And so suicide arises as a way to think about escaping that pain. And it's not something that people are doing intentionally, it's something that our minds and brains do in reaction to feeling that horrible.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting because, especially if people listening have taken psychology classes or you like have some general idea of evolutionary theory, it's not an adaptive response to pain. Like, it's not problem solving, it's not seeking out support. It's really counterintuitive. And I think that's what people struggle to empathize with when someone comes to them and says, I'm feeling suicidal, or I've been suicidal, or this is something I've struggled with in the past. Do you have any thoughts there on kind of why there's this mismatch of how you would intuitively cope with an experience or think about it, and then the way that people do, especially when they are feeling like a burden or grappling with that hopelessness?
Thank you for asking that, because I think you're exactly right about that mismatch. But what that speaks to is not that people who are struggling, not their unwillingness to do things that are helpful, but what it speaks to is the cruelty of mental health problems.
Yeah.
And the way that when we're suffering and struggling, it's actually hardest to do the things that would help us most. For example, we know that connecting with people when we're depressed or anxious, in a lot of ways, that's really helpful. We know that when we fear things, the thing that helps the most is to face those fears. And yet the nature of those mental health struggles is that you want to avoid those things. They seem like they're too much to even take on. And so I think about that a lot with suicidal thoughts, that hopelessness feels like there isn't any point in doing anything. And when someone says to someone who's hopeless, well, why don't you just do these things and you'll feel better? Unfortunately, that can make things worse, because the person can feel ashamed for not thinking about it that way, or not being able to do those things that might help them. And so I think that's a lot where therapy, certainly, but also our support networks, our friends and family, can help people to take those steps that feel impossible sometimes to take those steps when you're in that level of agony and anguish.
Mm-hmm. Another question that I want to ask you is, we have like this idea of suicidal ideation, so thinking about suicide, and then obviously some people engage in behaviors based on those ideations. And I would love to get your perspective there, especially for people listening that don't know how to support someone navigating that, or they're not empathizing from experience and they're like, I don't understand why you're feeling this way, but also then why you would act on these feelings. What are your thoughts there, and kind of how that escalates, I guess would be the correct term?
I was actually watching a piece of a movie, a suicide documentary, earlier today, and Thomas Joyner is interviewed, and he says, even if you haven't experienced suicidal thoughts, all of us have been through painful experiences. All of us have felt horrible. And so if you can imagine that and multiply it by 10, 100 times, whatever it is, you get some sense of how hard it is when you're feeling that bad to do things that might help you, because you're overwhelmed by it. And so I think that one of the things that is very hopeful overall is that little things that can support a person, so listening to them non-judgmentally and allowing space for them to talk about the suicidal thoughts, can actually make a huge impact. Because the opposite, where it's saying something judgmental, or you have so many good things in your life, why don't you look at the bright side, why don't you have some perspective, or why don't you just do this, this, and this? If a person is already feeling so bad, like they're burdening others, there's something really wrong with them, they're isolated and alone, having someone say, you should just do this, that just prompts more and more shame. Because often the person is already thinking that. They're already thinking, why can't I get myself out of this? They're trying to get themselves out of it. So to have someone respond that way, it kind of confirms that idea that they're wrong, and that they're not doing the right things, and that there's something that is unacceptable about what they're experiencing and how they're responding to it.
You mentioned listening empathetically. I'm sure you get this question all the time, and it's also like a big general media question, which is, how do we talk about suicide and suicidal ideation? Because it can be very triggering for people. And if you've been in therapy context, maybe group therapy, TBT can sometimes be a little bit different, but like you were saying, it can sometimes be discouraged to talk about these things. And there is, of course, literature supporting reasons why maybe certain settings aren't the best place to bring these up. But what are the best practices with having these conversations, both from the perspective of someone that's looking to ask for help or be vulnerable, and then also people that are wanting to offer support and not wanting to trigger someone's experience or bring attention to something if the person is like moved through it or coped past it?
I think that this is something that is on a lot of people's minds when they're feeling the complications of helping and supporting others. So I'm glad for the opportunity to talk about it. In general, there are individual differences depending on and what people need and how they feel supported. But in general, I'm in favor of being direct, open, and honest, because anything else just confirms that idea that it's unspeakable and that the person can't talk about it. And so I think just starting with open-ended questions. How do you feel? What do you think led you to feel that way? That sounds really hard. Simple, empathic, non-judgmental statements like that are helpful. I think that's really hard to do because it's uncomfortable and painful to hear that people are in those situations where they're feeling suicidal. So often the urge, which is totally understandable, is to jump in and problem solve or to kind of push away the conversation. So being direct is really helpful. To your point about not wanting to make the suicidal ideation worse by talking about it, in the vast majority of cases, what research we have that exists suggests that if someone is not thinking about suicide and you ask them about it, or they listen to music about it, or whatever it is, that they aren't going to start becoming suicidal. And so that's something we can kind of rest assured about. On the other hand, there is evidence that if you talk to someone about suicide and they are struggling with suicidal thoughts, then even talking about it can reduce some of the distress and intensity surrounding it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that one area, you mentioned DBT, that is worth mentioning. In group settings, there are rules about not going into details surrounding methods. I think that's a controversial area about how much that matters, but I think it makes sense. And I don't think it's necessary to go into details about methods if you're trying to understand why someone's experiencing that. I do think it is important to understand what people are thinking about in terms of methods for the next piece, which is making sure they're safe. So if someone has specific methods in mind or past methods they've used to try to end their lives or kill themselves, then actually it is important and helpful to know what those are so that you can help create a safer environment. Because the research really strongly points to the fact that if someone has firearms in their home, or they plan to overdose, or they plan whatever their plan is, that if you can restrict that, that can be life-saving. And so there's some nuance to it, but the general rule is it's better to talk about suicide than not, and keeping it open and non-judgmental and expressing compassion tend to be helpful.
What about peers and co-ruminating? Because we have a lot of young adults that listen to the podcast, and oftentimes with young adulthood comes your peers being the people you're leaning on the most. Maybe there's more fear and shame about going to parents or a counselor or a trusted adult to try and be vulnerable. And especially with mental health challenges, that can be a double-edged sword because you just don't have the training and expertise and emotional bandwidth and all the things at that point in life. And it's also not in like a negative connotation, but it's not your responsibility. Like, you're not their caretaker or guardian or parent or school counselor and all the things. So especially with young adults and co-ruminating, or if there's multiple people that are struggling, is that kind of like an outlier to the rule of thumb?
Have you seen the Netflix series Heartstopper?
No.
The recent series, the main star, the main character of it, has eating disorder symptoms and also some self-harm issues. And it's actually a really nice depiction of it because, one, it's realistic, and two, it shows the friends and the character's boyfriend both feeling like they don't know what to do to help him. And
Yeah.
so there's a nice scene where the boyfriend happens to have a psychiatrist who's an aunt, which is handy. And she says, your job is to ask him how he's feeling, be willing to spend time with him, and then gently urge him to seek help, to talk to his parents, to talk to a therapist. But your job is not to intervene and change it. You can't do that. And also, your mental health could deteriorate if you think you can and you're unable to change that. And so I was impressed by that because you don't see that a lot. There are much better mental health depictions than there used to be. But that really shapes, to answer your question, the boundaries around what we can do as peers. Even I'm a psychologist and I have psychologist friends, and even though I have the training as a therapist and the capacity as a friend, I don't approach it the same way at all. It's very
Yeah.
much listening, support, and also knowing my own limits. So are there things that I don't have the bandwidth for that you mentioned? Am I having a really hard week and I need all the resources I can? Well, then I can tell the friend, is there anyone else you can call, or can you call the crisis hotline 988? Have you tried to talk to your therapist? Can I help you by identifying a therapist? So finding something to do while not taking on the full responsibility for it, because you want to check in with yourself and your own mental health and understand really what you can do is very powerful, which is to show that you care. But what you can't do is control someone else's behavior or something like that.
Yeah.
And if it helps at all to think about it this way, by you modeling that you have certain boundaries around mental health and that you're taking care of yourself, that can be helpful for your friend too. It might not immediately feel good to them, but they're getting the message that, okay, my friend, when they're struggling or want to prevent struggling, they are doing things to take care of themselves. And so they're observing that as well. And I do think that model can be helpful.
Yeah, I think that was one of my biggest learnings, and I think it caused me a lot more struggle than I needed to experience was by surrounding myself with people that were feeling the same way. And it's instinctive. Like, we attract the energy we put out, and getting our feelings validated is really important, and also like an innate need. We look for that from people around us. And in this situation, it just adds a whole nother layer to the situation, and it can hurt it rather than help it. And I think even now, same thing, where like when I think about how I could help and support my peers, it wouldn't be like, listen to this podcast, or like, this is how we're gonna walk through this, and even like making a situation more safe, because that's not my role in their life, but being someone that they know they can have a fun night with and watch a show together or laugh and just call when they're not doing well. I think that you're adding like a great deal of positivity and support to their life that they can count on. And I think people underestimate how much that's valued. And even if they feel like they could do more, I think that is an incredible position to be in as a friend, if you know that they can count on you and you know that you can be an outlet for them to feel better and get out of their head and just connect.
That's exactly right. It can mean the world to someone who thinks that they're a burden and they're alone, to be with someone who likes being around them and who will do things with them. And the other part that you said, which I think is really important, is that often in therapy, we're trying to not avoid things. We're trying to really not distract. We're trying to process things. But as you know, with suicidal thoughts, actually, it's very important, especially during a crisis, to have that skill and tool of distracting until the intensity decreases. And the research
Yeah.
supports that, and that's certainly present in a lot of therapies that we do, that actually is not a good time to just keep. You want
Yeah.
to eventually get back to the causes, but while you're in a crisis, distraction may be the best thing to do.
Yeah, I just recorded an episode on anxiety, and I was like, let's not distract too much. Let's go towards that thing. This time we're like, distract, distract, distract. Watch as much Office as you want. Listen to, like, do whatever you need to do. And I think that's very true. Shifting gears a little bit and kind of expanding on how you can work through these thoughts. Well, I'm sure we'll get into identifying the core issues. You have a workbook, which we'll put in the show notes, about how people can work through suicidal thoughts, especially from the CBT framework. But can you give us like a 30,000 foot view of kind of what this process looks like? Because that's the other thing. If you haven't been to therapy for navigating suicidal ideation before, you really have no idea what to expect, because it's not a natural skill in life to be like, oh, I intentionally changed the way I think about things because it has really detrimental impacts on my life. So overview, what can people expect? And I think it's also helpful for parents and peers to understand the work that their friends and family might be doing.
Yeah, the cognitive behavioral therapy model kind of zoomed out, and at its basic level is that thoughts, emotions, and behaviors all influence each other. And when someone's in a suicidal mind state, often the thoughts are about being alone, about being a burden, that nothing in life matters, not feeling connected to it. And their perception, even though it's not their fault, often has some flaws to it because the cruelty of struggling with suicidal thoughts is that you're can be so hypercritical of yourself, and you can be unable almost to see reasons to believe that things can change or that
Yeah.
you can help to affect that. So, with the cognitive behavioral therapy model, really the work that's being done is finding ways to be aware, first of all, of suicidal thinking patterns and how they tend to increase pain, increase hopelessness, and look for evidence that prove you're not worthy, things like that. And then exploring evidence that suggests you are worthy and that things can change and you've been through hard things before and you can get through them and there are ways to cope. So that's a big piece of it at a zoomed out level. And then there's a lot more details in between, but that's the main idea, is looking at those, what thoughts, behaviors, and emotions, what can we do to impact those to basically disrupt the suicidal crisis and system.
While we were talking about behavioral changes we're making for our mental health, I had to jump on and share Magic Mind with you guys. You've heard me talk about them in a number of past episodes, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about their subscription. It is so easy, so convenient. You get free shipping, it shows up right at your door every single month. The cancellation process, if you change your mind, is super easy, and they have a money back guarantee. And they come in both 15 bottle containers and 30 bottle containers. I am obsessed with the little box it comes in. It doubles as like a little holding display case. So I just put the box right on my desk and grab a shot in the morning and at night. And it's so easy and absolutely adorable. If you are not familiar with Magic Mind, I'm obsessed with their sleep and performance shots. The performance shots help with having a sharper mind, lower stress, and calming energy. They have matcha as well as a bunch of additional natural supplements that help with staying alert and awake, but also calm and not so anxious and jittery. And then the sleep shots you take at night before you go to bed, and they have melatonin, ashwagandha, L-theanine, lavender, chamomile, everything that you would want in a tea or a drink that you would be drinking before you go to sleep. So this is my absolute favorite find recently. Past couple of weeks, I've been using Magic Mind sleep shots. They are such a game changer for my night routine. And we know that sleep is really, really important for depression and negative thought patterns. The biggest shift that occurred for me in my early mental health recovery at McLean was getting enough sleep and getting balanced sleep. And that's when I first saw that first shift in alleviation in suicidal ideation and suicidal thoughts, which is what we're talking about in today's episode. So sleep has a really special place in my heart. And with that, for me at least, comes also daytime alertness, because I am a chronic napper and napping then ruins my sleep routine. It's like this horrible, awful cycle that never ends. The combo of Magic Mind performance shots and sleep shots are an absolute essential for me, so that I'm staying awake and alert during the day, I'm not napping, and then at night, when it's time to go to bed, I have an easy, seamless experience falling and staying asleep. So if you guys want to get a Magic Mind subscription, you can go to magicmind.com/shepersisted20. Again, that's magicmind.com/shepersisted20 for up to 48% off with my code shepersisted20. One more time, 48% off with code shepersisted20. It will be in the show notes. If we can kind of go through the cycle and get detailed on thoughts and then the behaviors and then the emotion shift as well. And I'm sure we talked about shame earlier, sometimes guilt, like these emotions that can really cause this cycle to continue. The thoughts piece of it, I think, is really interesting. And like you said, the data doesn't support that engaging in these thoughts or going down that line of thinking, it doesn't have a positive impact on your mood, even though people sometimes do, like you said, use this to cope with feeling hopeless or like a burden or these other emotions. So in the thought piece of thing, what's arising? How can people rewire that? All the things.
So one piece that I want to mention is that I think it's part of the complexity. It's not helpful for example, continue to think about suicide as an escape and that it can increase suicide risk. However, it's really important to be compassionate with yourself and recognize one that that's not completely in your control. Your thoughts can kind
Yeah.
of do all kinds of things, and just approaching yourself with warmth. And so what a thought might look like is something like, I'm not going to get through this. I'm going to be in this pain forever. And a way that you might address that with cognitive behavioral therapy is dig a little bit deeper. Well, why is that? Well, it's because I'm incapable, and it's because the world is cruel, and nobody wants me around, and all of those thoughts. And so then once you've identified what those thoughts are, you can look and see, do they fit certain patterns? Often the patterns that we tend to see are all or nothing thinking. So the person is thinking about all the things, the mistakes they've made, and they can't think without some help about the things that they have contributed and how they've connected. They can't think about building confidence by looking at what they've done in the past. They can't think about, well, I feel like a burden, so maybe if I change the behavior and start intentionally contributing more, that might reduce the emotions. And so the process is identifying the thought, identifying what the pattern is. Is it all or nothing? Is it disqualifying the positive things that are coming up? And these are all from Aaron Beck's cognitive behavioral therapy, and David Burns also, his Feeling Good book has a lot of these common patterns in them. And so I found in therapy that even introducing those patterns helps people so much because they relate to them and they realize it's not just them. If someone's written a
Yeah.
book and there's a list of them, that's really helpful. And then the next piece is helping go through evidence against those thoughts and then coming up with a new reframed thought that's more accurate. And it's totally different than positive thinking because you aren't just saying, okay, you think you're a bad person, just think you're a good person. That doesn't work that way, right? That would be
Yeah.
nice if it did. It doesn't though. So rather what you're doing is you're building a case by examining evidence that supports that they're not a bad person and then coming up with a reframe thought that's more accurate and then acting as if that's the truth. And so that's a big part of what it is. And then the behavioral piece is very much adding in those things that connect a person, that tether them to life. What's meaningful to them? What are their values? How can they amplify those? Because under the crushing weight of suicidal thoughts, not everyone, but a lot of people withdraw, give up, and all of that. And so it's also finding things that feel doable with that energy level or whatever it is for creating a little more joy and connection in the person's life. So that's the main gist of how to build a hopelessness and to soothe some of the pain that's driving the suicidal thoughts.
I really like what you mentioned there, where you have to have that self compassion with the first thought because you can't necessarily control that, just like you can't control like an emotion as it rises, or if you've coped with something behaviorally a certain way for years, it's not immediately going to shift even if you've set that intention. But the next thought, or how you respond to it, or the evidence you collect against that initial thought, you do have that autonomy and choice and power there, which I think is really important. I'm curious, are there any behaviors or coping skills or activities that clients have found really helpful across the board? A few that you consistently recommend that people can try out if they're like, okay, I like the idea of increasing meaning, but I don't know where to start.
Sure. So I think about a couple of different types of behaviors. And one thing that my workbook really focuses on as a framework and that I use as a therapist is the idea that there have to be a menu of options because different things work for different people. So if one thing doesn't work, okay, well, we have 9 other things or 10 other things, and
Yeah.
that in itself can build hope getting through it. So one category I would say is self-soothing. And when someone's struggling with a mental health problem and feeling suicidal, they often are punishing themselves. They don't even think, oh, now's the time to actually soothe myself. So I think about if you have the flu or you're sick, at least some part of you knows that it's not your fault. It's just something that happens, and you kind of have to go easy on yourself. You have to have comfort foods. You can't do the things you normally do. Hopefully you can call out of work. And so I try to make that analogy that when you're struggling and in a lot of pain, that is the last time for more punishment and self-criticism. So things that tend to soothe people, I think a lot of people go to music. A lot of people go to, I like stand-up comedy because it's kind of the opposite of feeling bad when you're laughing. And I think the other part of it is that actually there's so much comedy now about mental health stuff. So it can kind of have like a two functions where
Yeah.
it's funny and you can resonate with it. So those are a lot of them. Getting outside, like just changing the perspective and going for a walk, taking a hot shower, anything that captures your attention and feels positive can be
Yeah.
helpful. So
You can
that's the
watch a horror
self-soothing.
movie. That was one of the big go-to ones that I heard a lot because you cannot feel like deeply sad and hopeless and jump scare at the same
Yes.
time. So
Yeah.
any of those where it's like it's just that all-encompassing emotion being evoked, it's really effective as an intervention.
Exactly, because what you're doing is your mind is kind of like a magnet when you're suicidal, and it's everything that confirms your negative views kind of sticks, and so it takes something to jolt out of that. So
Yeah.
that's exactly right, and it's trial and error too. So you see what works for you, and you try other things. And then the other piece I would say with the behaviors is trying not to isolate. And one way to do that is to reflect on your values. In my workbook, I talk about Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning that he wrote. It's a Holocaust survivor and as a psychiatrist, and talked about how even in the worst situations, I mean, he was doing suicide prevention in a concentration camp while he was held captive there.
Yeah.
There is still a way to find meaning. And so a lot of it boiling down to basics is spending some time to reflect, what are my values and what am I doing in my life that connects me with those values. And the other theme I've mentioned a few times, they don't have to be huge things. If you value being compassionate or charitable or educated or whatever it is, you can find something to do that just kind of connects you with that value. And then life doesn't feel so empty. And so
Yeah.
it's worth thinking about those types of things and making action plans for what something I might do to enhance that meaningful feeling.
For sure. The last thing I want to touch on is what people can do in a crisis because I know people are like, we know 988. We did an episode a while ago, and I'll put it in the show notes with Adia Fadai, and she is a 988 operator. So we like went through exactly what happens when you call and what they'll say and how you can still be anonymous and all the things. We did a similar one with Crisis Text Line and what people are commonly talking about. And we had a young adult volunteer on the podcast, and she went through kind of like how she typically responds and what people can expect. So generally those are resources, but there's still anxiety and apprehension about utilizing those. We talked about distraction. Is there anything else that you would recommend in crisis that people can utilize? I am almost positive people are listening to this not in crisis. They can write it down, maybe take a photo of a sticky note, whatever it is, to come back to this as a crisis survival plan. What other tips do you have for crisis?
For 988, I would go to their website and they have safety plan templates, and I
Mm-hmm.
would look there and fill out one. It's worth having a safety plan, like you
Yeah.
said, when you're not in crisis. But the main things that it has on there are, one, what is your main reason for living? Because when you're suicidal, it's hard to remember, wait, why do I want to hang on anyway?
Yeah.
And that can make it more salient. Again, that idea that you're kind of shining your attention and spotlight on something else. And also the idea that it doesn't have to be something huge. Some people say their family and members are what keep them going, or their pets, or whatever it is. But whatever it is, that's acceptable. So it's a reminder of that. The other piece is, of course, the emergency numbers, but people don't always want to call that.
Yeah.
I encourage it, but if you don't want to, you don't want to. The distraction and coping strategies. And then the thing that I'll add is the piece about making your environment safe. As we were talking about earlier, that's super important when you're in a high risk situation, that you put distance and time between yourself and the lethal methods, whatever they are. That is life saving. There is research looking at how long the typical intensity, like very intense suicidal thoughts, can last. And at their highest peak, often they diminish within hours. And so if you can get through that without having access to the lethal methods, having some support people that you can contact, having some coping skills, and remember your reason for living, that can be really life-saving. And I'll mention an app called the Virtual Hope Box, which has a lot of these ideas in them and includes distraction things in there like games that you can play and inspirational quotes and emergency numbers. And so the goal is to have this plan in place so that when you can't think clearly about it, you can access that, and that gives you the steps to
Yeah.
take. And so those are the main pieces: separation from lethal means, support people, emergency numbers, and your reason for living.
Yeah. There's, like you mentioned, there's so many different ways that we apply double standards to mental health. And I think the giving yourself an environment that you can be successful in is a great example of that. Like if you have celiac, you don't buy 12 loaves of sourdough when you go to Trader Joe's because no one has that level of self-restraint, even if you know there's going to be a negative consequence. If you're struggling with addiction, you don't spend 3 hours at the bar after your workday, hopefully. These are things you don't do because you know you're just setting yourself up to be in a situation where you have to use willpower. And humans don't have a lot of willpower, whether you're looking at them taking Grit Lab right now. And so we're talking about achieving your goals and deliberate practice with instruments. Willpower doesn't get you there. It's these contexts you put yourself in. And that's absolutely true for mental health and suicidal ideation. And I think that's really important to remember because I think, again, it comes back to the shame piece of why can't I just get through this thought? Why would I have to adjust the environment? But we adjust our environments for everything. And it's really, really key in allowing us to be successful. It's simple things like putting your alarm across the room so you can't get back in bed. All these things we do because as humans, we're very susceptible to our environments. We don't have a lot of willpower. And unfortunately, that works against us in this context.
You're absolutely right. And I think the analogy of other types of medical emergencies is correct too, in that if someone's having a heart attack, you don't expect them to figure it all out on their own. You pull in people that can support you. You contact emergency services. You have someone else drive you to the hospital. So when you're in a suicidal crisis, why in that emergency situation would you not want to reach out, except, as we mentioned, knowing the shame that comes with it and feeling like no one cares? So it can be helpful, just like you're saying, to think about it when you're not in crisis, so that when you're in crisis, you already have the plan laid out and don't even have to think too deeply about what you need to do.
100%. Well, if people want to get your workbook, or I know you have another book coming out as well, where can they do that?
My book is available on Amazon and a bookshop, and basically most places where books are available. It's usually at least a copy or two at Barnes and Noble. So it's not too hard to find if you're looking for it. And I think the guided journal I'll mention, which is just another format. It's much shorter, but I found that journaling people find really beneficial for a variety of things. And so the guided journal for suicidal thoughts workbook, kind of to your point, it's not ruminative, it's guided, and it has a lot of these cognitive behavioral therapy practices. That will be out in July 2025, and that'll be available Amazon, Bookshop, Barnes & Noble, all of the same types of websites.
Amazing. Well, I'll put that in the show notes, and thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on. It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me on to talk about this important topic.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of She Persisted. If you enjoyed, make sure to share with a friend or family member. It really helps out the podcast. And if you haven't already, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also make sure to follow along at She Persisted Podcast on both Instagram and TikTok, and check out all the bonus resources, content, and information on my website, shepersistedpodcast.com. Thanks for supporting, keep persisting, and I'll see you next week.